It's October 29th, 1929, a day that will forever be etched in the annals of history as Black Tuesday. The stock market, the beating heart of the American economy, crashes. Millions gone in the blink of an eye. Now you might think this was just another financial blip, a temporary setback. But what followed was far worse than anyone could have imagined. A decade-long economic catastrophe that would come to be known as the Great Depression. This wasn't just some figures on a balance sheet. This was real life. Families losing their homes, their livelihoods, their hope. The streets filled with queues of desperate men looking for any scrap of work. From the industrial cities of the north to the rural villages of the south, the entire world was gripped by hardship. But how did it come to this? How did a decade of prosperity and optimism turn into a decade of despair? What were the forces that pushed the world over the edge? In the next few minutes, we're going to journey back in time to uncover the causes of the Great Depression. We'll delve into the events that led to this economic disaster, and we'll examine the consequences, both immediate and far-reaching. It's a story that's both fascinating and sobering, a story that holds important lessons for us today. So stay with me, because understanding how the Great Depression happened is the first step to making sure it never happens again. To truly understand the why of the Great Depression, we need to rewind a bit back to the Roaring Twenties, a time of jazz, flappers, and seemingly endless prosperity. The United States in particular was booming. Factories were churning out goods, the stock market was soaring, and folks were living it up. But beneath this shiny surface, there were cracks starting to appear. Farmers, the backbone of the American economy, were struggling. Overproduction and falling prices meant they couldn't make a decent living. Many were losing their farms, their livelihoods, their way of life. Meanwhile, the rich were getting richer. The gap between the haves and the have-nots was widening at an alarming rate. This uneven distribution of wealth meant that most folks simply didn't have enough money to keep buying all the goods that were being produced. And that's a problem when your economy relies on consumer spending. Now let's talk about the banks. They were playing a risky game, lending money hand over fist, often to people who couldn't afford to pay it back. And to make matters worse, many folks were buying stocks on margin, essentially borrowing money to invest in the stock market. This created a bubble, a house of cards that was bound to collapse sooner or later. The government, meanwhile, wasn't exactly helping matters. They were following a policy of laissez-faire, which basically means leaving businesses to their own devices with little regulation or oversight. This might sound good in theory, but in practice, it meant that companies could get away with all sorts of shady practices like price fixing and manipulating the market. So you had a whole cocktail of factors brewing: struggling farmers, unequal wealth distribution, reckless banking practices, and a government that was turning a blind eye to the warning signs. It was a recipe for disaster. And on that fateful day in October 1929, the disaster struck. The stock market crashed, triggering a chain reaction that would plunge the world into a decade of economic hardship. Now let's dive deeper into why the Great Depression happened. And it wasn't just one thing, mind you. It was a perfect storm of economic missteps, a domino effect that started with a crash and ended with a decade of hardship. First and foremost, there's the stock market crash of 1929. This wasn't just a blip on Wall Street. It was a seismic shock that reverberated throughout the global economy. When the market plummeted, millions of investors lost their life savings. This wasn't just the wealthy elite. It was ordinary folks who had put their faith in the stock market, hoping to secure their future. This sudden loss of wealth had a ripple effect, causing a dramatic drop in consumer spending, which in turn hurt businesses and led to layoffs. But the stock market crash was just the beginning. The banking system, already weakened by risky practices, began to crumble. Banks had invested heavily in the stock market, and when the market crashed, they lost massive amounts of money. This led to a wave of bank failures, and people who had deposited their hard-earned cash lost everything. This created a widespread panic, causing even more people to withdraw their money from banks, further exacerbating the crisis. Then there's the issue of overproduction. During the 1920s, factories were churning out goods at an unprecedented rate, but wages weren't keeping pace, and as a result, ordinary people couldn't afford to buy all the stuff that was being produced. This led to a glut of unsold goods, forcing businesses to cut back on production and lay off workers. The government's response, or lack thereof, also played a significant role. Initially, they followed a policy of laissez-faire, believing that the market would eventually correct itself. But the market didn't correct itself. It spiraled further downward, and the government's inaction only made matters worse. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 was another major blow. This act raised tariffs on imported goods, hoping to protect American businesses. But it backfired spectacularly. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs, leading to a sharp decline in international trade. This hurt American businesses even further, as they lost access to foreign markets. To make matters worse, a severe drought hit the Great Plains in the early 1930s. This turned fertile farmland into a dust bowl, forcing thousands of farmers to abandon their homes and livelihoods. This mass migration only added to the economic hardship and social unrest of the time. So, as you can see, the Great Depression wasn't caused by a single event. It was a complex web of interconnected factors, a perfect storm of economic missteps that led to a decade of hardship and despair. Now, to answer your question, would an expert historian be satisfied with this explanation? The answer is, it depends. The causes of the Great Depression are still debated by historians to this day. What I've presented here is a simplified overview, highlighting some of the key factors, but there are many other nuances and complexities that could be explored in greater detail. However, for the purposes of this video, I believe this explanation provides a comprehensive and accessible overview of the main causes of the Great Depression, suitable for a general audience. The Great Depression wasn't just a blip in history, it was a seismic shift that reshaped the world. It left millions destitute, shattered economies, and sowed the seeds of political unrest. In its wake, governments around the world began to rethink their economic policies. The idea of laissez-faire, the hands-off approach that had dominated the 1920s, was largely discredited. Instead, there was a growing recognition of the need for government intervention to stabilize the economy and protect the most vulnerable. The New Deal, implemented by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the United States, was a prime example of this shift. It was a series of programs and reforms designed to provide relief for the unemployed, recovery for the economy, and reform to prevent future depressions. While controversial at the time, the New Deal is now seen as a landmark moment in American history, marking a fundamental shift in the relationship between the government and the economy. But the effects of the Great Depression weren't just economic. It also had a profound impact on society and culture. The hardship and despair of the era led to a questioning of traditional values and a search for new ways of thinking. It also fueled the rise of extremist ideologies in some parts of the world, most notably in Germany, where the economic devastation helped pave the way for the rise of Nazism. The Great Depression ultimately ended with the onset of World War II. The massive government spending required for the war effort helped to stimulate the economy and put people back to work. But the war also brought its own set of horrors, and it wasn't until after the war that the world truly began to recover from the economic devastation of the 1930s. The Great Depression is a stark reminder of the fragility of our economic systems and the importance of learning from the mistakes of the past. It's a story that continues to resonate today as we grapple with new economic challenges and uncertainties. So, what lessons can we learn from the Great Depression? How can we prevent such a catastrophe from happening again? These are questions that we all need to ponder. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel for more historical deep dives. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family, because understanding the past is crucial for shaping a better future. Thanks for watching.